There's no denying that talking about race can often become heated, divisive, and downright uncomfortable. The Living Undivided show, hosted by Chuck Mingo, exists to be a place where conversations on race are approached with grace and empathy. Chuck is the founder and CEO of Courageous Love, a racial healing, solidarity, and justice movement launched in 2015. Through the movement, thousands of participants have been catalyzed into action. Each week on the show, Chuck introduces the audience to a guest who is a change agent, reaching across racial lines and working toward racial healing. These stories are examples of the grace, boldness, and courageous love necessary to bridge the divide in our country. This is Living Undivided.
I have to say, this is a bucket list moment for me because I am so honored to be spending time with my guest today, Bryan Stevenson, who many people know your work, but just to kind of summarize it, a lawyer who for the last 30 years has been leading the Equal Justice Initiative, where you've been doing incredible work. And at this point, I don't know the number, I might be wrong on this, but at least 125 people.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
125 people that you have seen exonerated off of death row through your work. Many of those people who were falsely accused. And so just inspired to be with you today.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being a part of this.
Absolutely.
Now, I have to say, I want to start in an interesting place because you are a lawyer. And one of the things you are also is just very generous. And so I want to thank you for letting my wife and kids have an opportunity to meet you. My kids are on spring break, and I told them one of the reasons that you're going with me to Montgomery is because I'm hoping you get a chance to meet who I believe is a modern day civil rights hero.
Oh, thank you.
I mean that. I mean that. What I didn't know was that my kids were going to have a question for you. And it was probably, I don't know, maybe a question that you've not received before.
Okay.
You know, we do something in our house on every Thursday is a donut day. And so my kids wanted to know, where does Bryan Stevenson go in Montgomery to get his donuts? And the answer was?
Krispy Kreme.
The answer was Krispy Kreme.
I thought it was more unique than in fact it is. I didn't realize they're all over the country, but.
Yes, but we all like what we like. And so I love just seeing you be a lawyer and make a very passionate defense for Krispy Kreme and why we should go there.
I used to drive past the Krispy Kreme and I wouldn't stop. But when they had the hot donut sign flashing, I would put on the brakes and have to spin around and go get some.
It's like the beacon of light that
yes,
we all
that's
draw
right.
to.
That's exactly right.
Well, I would love to start though by just giving people a little bit of background into your story. So we are in the Equal Justice Initiative. We're in your offices.
That's right.
Talk about the work that you do here.
We provide legal services to the poor, the accused, the convicted, the condemned. We have a lot of people in our jails and prisons who I believe have been wrongly convicted. I think there are thousands of innocent people in jails and prisons. We have tens of thousands of people who have been unfairly prosecuted, hundreds of thousands of people who I think have been unfairly sentenced. And so we try to meet the legal needs of people who don't have the resources to get the legal help they need. We also are really committed to challenging the legacy of racial inequality in this country, and that means talking about the damage done by enslavement and lynching and segregation, and confronting the problems that the poor in this country have. And so it's a really challenging area to work in, but it's also a very dynamic place, and I feel really proud of the work we do and the incredible people I get to work with while doing it.
Yeah, it is, and it's very much a team effort for you. I mean, there are a lot of people who are part of the work that you do. And I also would imagine that this has to have some of its roots in who you were and who you are as a person. So I'd love to know more about who was Bryan Stevenson as a kid? Who were you as a kid? Like, what are some of the experiences that shaped you as a kid?
Yeah, well, I mean, I grew up in the country, and so we were poor, and we lived in a rural, kind of racially segregated area. And you know, we didn't have a portal on the larger world, and that was the real challenge of segregation and the challenge of the kind of poverty that I think impacts too many people. You don't get a chance to see another world, and I was really blessed to be shaped and molded by parents and grandparents, elders who would embrace me. I was the kind of kid who lived in a household with a grandmother. My grandmother was a classic African-American matriarch. I talk about her a lot. And when I was about 9, she started giving me these hugs, and she'd squeeze me so tightly, I thought she was trying to hurt me. And then she'd see me an hour later, and she'd say, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" And if I said no, she would jump on me again. So by the time I was 10, my grandmother taught me, every time I would see her, I'd say, Mama, I'll always feel you hugging me. And she worked as a domestic her whole life, and when she got into her 90s, she fell and broke her hip, and then she was diagnosed with cancer, and she was dying. And I was in college at the time. I went to Eastern University, which is a Christian college in Pennsylvania, and I went to see my grandmother. And I just couldn't imagine being in the world without her. That's how supported I felt by some of the elders in my community. And I remember just pouring my heart out and just holding her hand, saying all these things. Her eyes were closed. I wasn't even sure she could hear what I was saying. And then I knew it was time to leave, and I stood up to leave, and I took a step, and my grandmother squeezed my hand. Then she opened her eyes, and she looked at me, and the last thing she said to me, she said, Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?
Wow.
And then she said, I want you to know I'm always going to be hugging you. And even though we were poor, even though we were excluded, even though we were disfavored, I feel blessed and privileged because I was a child who was embraced by other people, who affirmed my humanity, who affirmed my dignity, who told me that my dreams weren't crazy dreams. And you don't have to have a lot of money, you don't have to have a lot of status, but if you're someone who's hugged by people who affirm your capacity to make a difference in the world, there's just no substitute for how that can inspire you to do things that you might not otherwise do.
And that is such an incredible story.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about a couple things. It makes me think about just the power of that you knew you were loved.
Mm-hmm.
And as I see, you know, I've done everything Bryan Stevenson. I've listened to the TED Talks. I've read the books. I quote you. In fact, we used to call this podcast Living Proximate.
Ah.
And the reason we called it that is because of your quote.
Yeah.
So, you know, rather than quote yourself to yourself, I won't do that. But I'll just say that I see this through line of love in the work that you do.
Yeah.
Why don't you put words to that? What do you see of your work that is rooted in love?
Well, virtually everything, because I use the Niebuhr quote, Reinhold Niebuhr, the theologian, love is the motive, but justice is the instrument. The way I think we manifest love for people who are oppressed, for people who are abused, we have this false idea that if someone is enslaved, if someone is being terrorized, that someone is being condemned and facing execution, if someone is being poorly treated in a jail or prison, we can go and say we love them and pray with them and then walk away and feel good about what we have done. I don't believe that's the way love works. Love demands justice, it demands compassion, it demands relief for those who are oppressed and in bondage. And that is for me the motivation, and I see a whole society that has been constrained and contaminated and burdened by our long history of racial inequality. And I want us to confront that, not only because I'm tired of seeing people presumed dangerous and guilty, unfairly treated, mistreated, but it's also because I have enough love for the people I encounter to want them to get to a better place, to not be burdened by the blindness of bigotry and discrimination. And, it very much shapes my worldview and the kind of work and the kind of person I want to be. I think, if you allow yourself to give up the love that animates, that makes life beautiful, that makes hope resonate, that makes joy meaningful, then you give away the most precious thing you have. And even though people can be hateful, and even though people can be angry, and people can be destructive, you have to find a way to hold on to your love. I think about this a lot, really kind of thinking historically about the black experience in this country. I mean, enslaved black people who were tortured and brutalized and had their children taken away, had every right to want retaliation and retribution against their enslavers, against the white people who had mistreated them. But when emancipation came, they had an instinct, they had an insight that to be whole and healthy and human, they couldn't give away the love that had allowed them to endure slavery by hating those who had enslaved them. And we don't talk about the kind of love and commitment it took to be neighbors with people who hated you, who oppressed you. And even during that time of lynching, people didn't just retaliate with mobs and violence. They found a way to hold on to their love. And when people were being excluded and segregated, and my parents had to deal with those signs, white and colored, they weren't directions, they were assaults, and they created injuries. But they didn't teach us to hate. They didn't teach us to be angry. They taught us to love. And I actually think it's love that gives you the power to negotiate all of these complexities. And I don't think we talk enough about love in social justice spaces.
Right. No, I mean, we in our movement of Undivided, we talk about courageous love, and that this is a moment that demands courageous love. And I just hear that in your words. And I also know that for you, that's also rooted in your faith. And so I'd love for you to just take us to church. Talk about what was church like for you? What role, like just the spiritual nature in your work is so evident. And I'd love to just have you talk about it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I grew up in a very musical family, and so we had a piano in my house when I was a little boy, and then we lost the piano. But around 8 or 9, I started playing, and in my church was a kind of a country church. You know, if you could play a chord, they were like, all right, you're going to be playing. And I grew up.
I know that church.
And for me, music was a big part of the experience. And I used to play for devotional services until I was good enough to play for the main service. I just played during testimonial. And it was a great place to develop as a musician, but to also understand the power of faith, you know, because I'd be playing and people would come in and sometimes they'd have these heartbreaking testimonies. They'd talk about how, well, this week I didn't have enough food to feed my children, and this week one of my kids didn't come home, and this week this happened, and this week that happened. But at the end of their testimony, they would always start singing, and they'd start singing, wouldn't take nothing from my journey now, or I get joy when I think about it. And, you know, and you'd find their key, and you'd want to embrace them for that joy, for that faith.
I love that. Find their key.
Find their key,
That's right.
you know, and you just have to find their key, and you know, and they might get to the next verse and change keys on you. You'd have to just follow them.
That's right.
And that created a sense of community, of connection. It was the only place as Black kids that we got to say anything, where somebody would applaud you, where someone would affirm you. And then as I got older, I was really fortunate to, you know, find other spaces where that instinct for community could be made realized. But yeah, no, I'm really grateful. You know, I grew up in a family where, you know, we were raised in an AME church, but my mother started playing for a Baptist church, and so I started playing there. And then, you know, we had a charismatic orientation in the churches where I was. I went to a Baptist college, but I started playing at Pentecostal churches. And so, you know, I've been in a lot of faith spaces, and what always matters to me is that there's an opportunity for people to feel affirmed, to feel challenged, to feel inspired, and people to know that God's grace is sufficient.
Yeah, I love that. And I had forgotten that you said you went to Eastern College.
Yeah.
Right outside of Philadelphia.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm from Philadelphia.
Is
I've been
right?
to Eastern's campus, absolutely. So
Yeah.
Tony Campolo.
Tony Campolo.
I'm
that's
thinking.
right. Yeah, he was one of my professors, and you know, I was playing at a church in West Philly for a long time, and yeah, that community was really important when I was a young person. I had a choir. I was the director of the choir there at Eastern, the Angels of Harmony. We'd go all around the region, you know, playing and giving concerts. And it was a really important time for me. I was a philosophy major, and when I got to be a senior, I was so caught up in Eastern, and I played sports, I was into music, I was having such a great experience that when I became a senior, somebody came up to me one day and said, "You're a philosophy major. Do you know that nobody's going to pay you to philosophize when you graduate?" And I was really kind of taken with that. I was like, oh my God. And I started looking into graduate programs. And because I was a first generation college student, I didn't know that if you want to do graduate work in this country in history or English or political science, to get admitted to graduate school, you have to know something about history, English, or political science. I was very intimidated by that. So I kept looking, and to be honest, that's how I found my way to law school.
Wow.
Because you don't need to know anything to go to law school. You don't. And so I signed up for that and then ended up at Harvard. But Eastern was a great place to kind of integrate faith and reasoning and belief, and I still have really fond memories of that space.
I love that. I love that. I want to fast forward,
Yeah.
honestly, to the moment that we're in.
Yeah.
And I'd love to, you know, just spend a couple minutes having you coach me personally, people in this space who are living in this moment of racial reckoning that I would say is most profound, quite frankly, since the Civil Rights Movement. And yet it feels like this liminal space where it's, I want to believe that we're moving forward, and obviously I'm committed to that, but it also feels like we do a lot of waffling and back and forth. So I'd love to just ask you some questions in that vein. The first one being, as you think about 2020, and specifically, I call it the perfect storm, the pandemic, what we saw with George, what do you see happening to the soul of our country? and to the soul of people who are seeing this right now?
Yeah, I think much like what we saw in the 1950s and 60s, where people were forced to witness well-dressed black church-going people being beaten and attacked by dogs and fire hose simply because they wanted the right to vote, simply because they wanted to be treated fairly, we're being asked to ask ourselves, what kind of community do we want? What kind of nation do we want to be? What kind of people are we going to be? Are we going to be people who are just indifferent to gratuitous violence directed at some folks because of their color, to abuse, to oppression? Are we going to be people who respond, who react, who end the silence? I think that is the question posed to us by 2020. And a lot of people then ask, well, yes, I want to be that person, but I don't know how to do it. And that's why I feel like there's such an urgency in this moment for learning. You know, I think learning is an action item. It's something you do. And we're inviting people to our sites in Montgomery because we want them to learn. We have a calendar. We want people to sign up for it. And every day we'll send you something that we think you should know about the history of our country. We want people to learn about the problems that are evident in communities that are different. And that learning then will yield some insights that get to next steps, that get to solutions, that get to answers. And I do think this is a really important moment. There's a lot of fear and anger being preached by a lot of people, where people are being told to hate more, to distrust more, to believe less about the future and the hope that I think we have in front of us. And that means it's a moment of crisis. And in crisis, we have to be committed to responding, you know, with love, with hope, with a commitment to justice.
Absolutely. I want to double click on something you said. Learning is an action item.
Yes.
Learning is something you do. I'll admit that I think sometimes we downplay learning in this moment. Right? As if it's passive. Well, you're just learning. You're just reading about. But we have to start there because, and let's talk about that. You have created a memorial for peace and justice. And the reason you've done that is because we need to confront that history.
That's right.
We don't learn that history. So talk about that and how that ties into even what people can do in this moment.
Yeah, I think if you ask most people, well, how many indigenous people died when Europeans came to this country? They don't know the answer to that. We haven't been required to understand the violence and the damage that was done by Europeans who came to this continent where there were millions of native people. And we killed most of them through famine and war and disease. And that's why I believe it was a genocide. And we haven't acknowledged that. If you ask people, are we a post-genocide society? Most will say no, only because they don't know. If you drove to my office today, which is a billboard right up the road here, I saw it this morning, and we're in this debate about casinos in Alabama, and there's a debate about whether we should bring that in here, lotteries, et cetera. And a lot of people don't want it to happen. A lot of people of faith don't want it to happen. But somebody put up a billboard, and I'm worried that it might have been a faith community. And on the billboard it says, "Don't let the Creek Indians steal Alabama." And not only is it racist, you would never say, "Don't let white people kill black." It's not, but it's so ignorant about our history. We actually stole this land from native people. Alabama, that's a native word. Half the states in this country are native words, and we haven't reckoned with that. And we hid behind this narrative of racial difference. We created a constitution that talks about liberty and justice for all, but we didn't apply those values to indigenous people. And then we allowed that same mindset to make us tolerate, comfortable with enslavement and the brutality of slavery, what it did to everybody to separate them from a healthy human relationship. It's something we haven't talked about, we haven't acknowledged. Most people have no idea how many enslaved people were brought to this country. They don't know where the slave trading sites are. They haven't been required. And then, of course, the terror that came after that, the lynchings, that's what we're really focused on getting people to appreciate, because most people in this country live within a few miles of a space where mobs lynched black people, tortured black people, destroyed the hopes and dreams of an entire community. So yes, I do believe that learning is critical. And when you learn, you begin to think differently about the things that you hear people say. You respond differently. And I think that is the challenge that we face.
I think that's so profound in a moment to just think about, like, what are we learning in this moment? It's really important that we are understanding this moment for what it is. And I would say one of the things I know about you is that learning is not about guilt.
Yeah.
And it's not about getting stuck, but it's really the invitation to empathy. You talk about getting proximate, and in our work we talk about empathy. I'd love for you to just talk about the power of empathy. How do you leverage empathy in the work that you do?
Yeah. Well, I think I want people to have an opportunity to confront things that are difficult and challenging so that we might get to a better place. I want to invite people. I want people to feel welcome, to stand with us, even if it's a difficult process. One of the exhibits in our museum is a collection of jars filled with soil.
Yes.
And these are jars with the names of lynching victims and the dates. And we ask people to go to lynching sites and actually fill the jar with soil from the lynching site to honor these people who've never been acknowledged. And we've been doing this for several years, and we have hundreds of jars in the site. And we did one in West Alabama a couple of years back, and a middle-aged black woman went to a site to collect soil. And she was nervous about it because the site she went to was kind of remote. But when she got there, she said, I'm going to do this. And she found the lynching space, and she got down on her knees. And she said, a man drove by in a pickup truck, white guy, and he started staring at her. And he slowed down, and then he stopped, and he turned around and drove back by again and stared at her some more. She got really afraid. Yeah. And then the man parked his truck, and he got out of the truck, and he started walking toward her. We tell people that they don't have to explain what they're doing. Right. So she was just going to say, I'm getting dirt for my garden. And this man walked over to her, and sure enough, he said, what are you doing? And she told me later, she said, Mrs. Stevenson, something got a hold of me. And when that man asked me that, I told him, I'm digging soil because this is where a black man was lynched, and I'm going to honor his life today. And she said she got afraid, and she started digging, and the man just stood there. And we give everybody a memo that talks about the lynching. And the man said, does that paper talk about the lynching? She said, it does. And then he said, can I read it? And she gave the man the paper. He read the paper. And afterward, he put the paper down, and he shocked her by saying, excuse me, ma'am, but would it be all right if I helped you? Wow. And she said, yes. And she said that man got down on his knees next to her. And she offered him the implement to dig the soil. And he said, no, 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 you keep that. I'll just use my hands. And she said he started throwing his hands into the soil and putting it in the jar. And he kept throwing his hands. And she said he was doing it with such conviction. Yeah. His hands were turning black with the soil. And he kept doing it, and it moved her. And she said, Mr. Stevens, I couldn't help it. A tear started running down my face. And the man saw the tear, and he stopped, and he said, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm upsetting you. And she said, no, 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 you're blessing me. Yeah. And he kept digging with his hands, and she kept digging with the implement, and they got near the top of that jar. And she looked at him, and he was slowing down. And then she saw that his shoulders were shaking. And then she saw a tear running down his face. Wow. And she stopped, and she put her hand on his shoulder, and he said, are you all right? She said, are you all right? And the man said, no, 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 I'm not all right. And then the man said, I'm just so worried that it might have been my grandfather who participated in lynching this man. And she said they both sat there on the roadside weeping. They finished putting the soil in the jar, and afterward the man said, I want to take a picture of you holding the jar. She said, I want to take a picture of you holding the jar. And they took pictures of one another. She said, I'm going back to Montgomery to put this jar in the museum. And the man said, would it be all right if I followed you? And he came back with her, and I watched these people enter that space. And beautiful things like that don't always happen when we tell the truth.
Right.
But until we tell the truth, we deny ourselves the beauty that is redemption, that is justice. Yeah. And what I want people to understand is that they are welcome to kneel with us who are trying to resurrect this history that we've forgotten, to join us in putting the soil in the jar and help us lift up the truth that we might get to this better place. There is something better waiting for us. And I want it not just for my friends and family, not for my community, I want it for everybody. Yeah. But we can't get there if we don't come together. And that's the power of the opportunity of the moment that we're in. The doors are wide up. You know, in the church we do this. The doors of the church are wide open. And we are in a moment, yes, of conflict and division, of fear and anger, but we are also in a moment where an invitation is being offered. That's why we built these sites. They are an invitation to all who are looking for something better. It's a place where you can confront the truth, and maybe it will cause confession. Maybe it will cause repentance, but that's the path to salvation. That's the path to restoration. That's the path to redemption, and we should be excited about that.
Oh, man. Well, Bryan, I have to say, you give me hope.
Well, thank you,
I
brother.
am encouraged and inspired by you. Final question, what gives you hope in this moment?
It's been great to be home here in Montgomery every day for the last year because it's allowed me to think about the people who came before me they inspire me. They give me hope. You know, I stand on the shoulders of people who did so much more with so much less. They didn't have the resources I did. They didn't get encouragement from people who would fly in just to encourage them. They had to push so hard. I think about people like John Lewis, who was such a friend and mentor. He had to frequently say, "My head is bloody but not bowed."
Wow.
I've never had to say that. They inspire me. They encourage me. They make me believe that if we just keep fighting, if we stand when people say sit down, if we speak when people say be quiet, we can achieve something that can help us get to that kind of promised land that we dream of.
All right, so fill in the blank. Living undivided means?
It means not accepting inequality, not accepting injustice, not accepting half freedom, half community, half healthy, half fellowship. It means really wanting to be truly connected, truly reflective of God's grace and purpose. It means insisting on the beloved community, not just community, but beloved community. And that's always inspired me. Look, I have it so much better off than the people who came before me, and they had it better off than the people who came before them. But it's not enough. There is still these contaminants in the air. There's still too much inequality. There's still a deficit of justice. And I think if we are going to be undivided, we have to be committed to full justice, full equality, full freedom, full fellowship. And that's what my work is about. And that's why we want to invite people to come and spend time with us. I mean, we have the museum and memorial. We have places of reflection, places where you can engage in not only the truth, but also in consideration of what the remedies might be, the path forward might be. And so I want to invite everybody to come and spend time with us here in Montgomery at the Equal Justice Initiative at our site. I want to invite people to learn, that action item learning, by going to our website and looking at the videos, signing up for the calendars, engaging with the content that we're trying to create for people. And then I want people to share. You know, that's what, for me, undivided is. If I have something good that can help you, I want to share it with you. I don't want to hold it on for just me. And that's what we get to experience here when we actually see the manifestation of justice in the lives of people who have been treated unjustly.
Well, Bryan, you are doing that in an incredible way. And I just want to say thank you so much for your courageous love. You are a person who models that for all of us.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I'm inspired by you.
Thank you.
This episode of Living Undivided is brought to you by Courageous Love, a movement on a mission to unite and ignite people toward racial justice. The show is produced in Cincinnati, Ohio. You can learn more about our host, Chuck Mingo, and the movement by visiting www.chuckmingo.com. That's all for this episode. Join us next time for another episode.